shortly. It's co-organised by the Global Commission on Drug Policy, Trinity College Dublin, where I'm based, and the great and wonderful Anna Liffey Drug Project, who I'm also aware of. We're joined by Tony Duffin with regards to that. The session is being recorded, and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. And also, as we know, it's a busy time of year, this will be posted on YouTube, and we'll be able to share it from there. Today, we have a fabulous lineup of speakers from across the globe, which is amazing. Our first speaker, which will give us an introduction and a background, is Professor Julia Buxton from the British Academy, and she's a global professor in criminology at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. She'll be followed by Dr. John Collins, Executive Director of the London School of Economics, LSE's International Drug Policy Unit in the UK, followed by then Professor Joanne Csete, Associate Professor of Population and Family Health at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health in New York. So welcome all the way from New York, Joanne. And then we'll have Ms. Csete Reitano, Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime based in Switzerland. And then finally, Mr. Tony Duffin, CEO of the Anna Liffey Drug Project here in Ireland, will give us the closing remarks. So it's a great event. I'm delighted you can join us either live today or later on YouTube. So with no more ado, I will hand you over to Professor Julia Buxton. The floor is yours, Julia. Thank you.
Many thanks, Catherine. And many thanks to Anna Liffey and to Trinity for hosting this discussion that we're having today, which, as you've mentioned, is the DevPol Journal and the Global Commission on Drug Policy. What I just wanted to do very briefly with the 5 minutes that I have is just to really go over what myself and my co-editors, Mary Chinnery-Hesse and Khalid Tanasti, we're trying to achieve with this special edition of the DevPol Journal. We're not the first people who have aimed to bring together academics and practitioners and people who work in the NGO and not-for-profit sector. We're certainly not the first people to call for better praxis and better engagement and cooperation between academics and practitioners. But we do feel that this call for enhanced collaboration has to be repeatedly and loudly made in the particular sphere of development. And we're not sure whether it's because of reputational concerns, but there is this constant arm's length treatment of drug policy issues and drugs within development. So what we're trying to do with this special edition was to bring together a range of different voices and different perspectives in order to really underscore and highlight the enormous challenges that drug policy and criminalisation-based drug policy in particular poses for development prospects. I'm just going to distill this into 4 very, very quick points. The international system of drug control is a universal system. What I thought was interesting about the way this panel was being put together was the emphasis on the connections between the global and the local. And I think really what we're seeing is this important connectivity of the harms that are carried out by a universal policy of criminalisation and how that impacts universally, whether we're in Ghana, whether we're in Thailand, whether we're in Ireland. The impacts of this model harm all of our communities. And here we're interpreting the word development to include security, human rights, and respect for fundamental rights. So firstly, drug policy impacts the development prospects for all of us. Secondly, in particular, it impacts the development prospects of the poorest countries in the world. And we argue very strongly in the book that the SDGs will not be obtainable if we continue with drug criminalisation. The third emphasis we are trying to make in the book is the accretion of harms which are being caused by a century-long system of controlling substances that really we need to think about new approaches to regulating. And then the final point is that we are seeing some change and some reform and modification within drug criminalisation and the international system of drug control, but the concern that this is happening within the paradigm of prohibition and that this kind of reform process could actually cause more harm than good. So we look at these from a variety of perspectives, from free trade, the environment, perspectives on stakeholders and prisons, but obviously on this panel are 3 colleagues who contributed to the special edition in Joanne, Tuesday and John. So I'll hand over now to John to develop some of the ideas that he put forward very kindly in the journal. And please read it, it's open access, and open access means that we're trying to get this out to as many people as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And yes, great that you're handing over to John. And John will give us sort of a historical perspective, but certainly you've set the scene for us today in terms of that tension between the harm reduction and drug policy and control. So thank you for setting the scene for us. And we'll hand over now to you, to John. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It is an honour. It's a pleasure to be part of this. Thank you again, Julia and Khalid and the editors of the journal for inviting me to be part of it. I've enjoyed every discussion event I've been part of. I've enjoyed the whole process of putting it together. It has been a really excellent opportunity. I also thank you to Catherine. I did my undergraduate in Trinity, so it's always a pleasure to virtually return to the university. So it's thank you for hosting this as well today. I assume everyone can see that, or actually I'll put it like that because I had trouble the other day. Actually, I'm no longer with the London School of Economics. I joined the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, so I'm the Director of Academic Engagement there. And effectively, exactly my contribution to this is I'm first and foremost a historian of international drug control. So what I did from my contribution was to try to understand the longer process of drugs and development. So how we think about the idea of drugs and illicit drug economies within long-term development processes. And I think part of this was an attempt to have sort of a revisionist take on our idea of alternative development, that we think of it purely in the context of drug control debates, within the context of the UN treaties on drugs, within the context of the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And what I'm trying to say is a lot of the themes that we see emerge, or we see treated under alternative development, really have a longer lineage, that these discussions go much further back. And actually we need to stop thinking about drugs and development as something that's parallel to mainstream development processes or mainstream policy, and actually something that in many parts of the world was innate, was intricate to the main policy developments. So really the basis for this, the famous historian William O. Walker, I quote him, "There's no adequate way to understand the foreign and security policies, policy issues facing Asia without an appreciation of opium's role." So I effectively expand that and say there's no way to actually understand the economic and development policies throughout large parts of Asia, and I think we can extend that to other parts of the world, without understanding the role of drugs in illicit drug economies. So Catherine, could you just nod if you can actually see my PowerPoint? Okay, good. I think one of the things is, and Julia's written a lot about this and done some really superb work on the political economy of drugs. And what I would say is I think there is probably a little bit of a silo between historical analysis of drug markets and political economy analysis of drug markets. And I think there's scope for a greater overlap of these discussions. So a lot of political and economy analysis, I think, derive from history, but perhaps we don't necessarily incorporate the very deeply granular and nuanced history of, say, the opium monopolies in Southeast Asia or revenue farming in Malaya or whatever it is. And I think when you do that, we can see that regulations of drugs and prohibitions of drugs and the outcomes of these were an evolving process over a century and longer, right? So instead of seeing it as drugs were illegal at one period and then suddenly illegal, we see it as a process of regulatory evolution if we look at some of the historical nuances. And so this is the basic point, I think, is that drugs and development is fundamentally, it's a historical process of state regulation. It's about control. It's about setting geographic boundaries, both economically and physically. So it's not just something that's external to the state. It's not just something that the state had to deal with. It was something actually fundamental to the state's development in a lot of these places. If we think of Burma, if we think of, frankly, Malaya, or a lot of these regions or parts of Southeast Asia in particular. If we think of India, we think of cases like the opium wars, how important that was to the geopolitics and certainly the economics, or subsequently the economics of East Asia. These start to take a much greater historical profile. So these are some of the key arguments that I make. And throughout all of these policies, whether it's the mercantilist era imperial policies, whether it's state formation, whether it's these issues of the limits of governance, right? We think of continually the issues that governments face, whether it's Colombia, whether it's Burma, is that the inability, right? The argument, the art of not the Scott argument of the art of not being governed, that the states can't reach into these areas And so actually these illicit economies represent in many ways the boundaries and the limits of governance in these areas. And then also the point about the distribution of economic gains. What role does this have in, firstly, capital accumulation and the development of capitalist societies? And Carl Trocchi has written an awful lot about this. And then how does that impact the political economies of these areas? So this is, again, to reiterate the point that I'm trying to make, is that while we talk of this in a kind of contemporary alternative development, we have to give these communities alternatives so that they can join the mainstream of the economy and join the mainstream of the polity. That misses, I think, the longer term evolutionary process that is underway with illicit economies. And partly it is that well-known idea that the role of illicit economies is in many ways to keep people separate from the state. And then government policies, as Julia was highlighting, reinforces that separateness, right? It's these repressive, anti-democratic, anti-engagement approaches which basically push communities further away from the mainstream polity. So I don't have time to go into much of the examples that I give on this, but I'll just give some of these as a conclusion to end with, and to highlight that what I highlighted in my paper is a lot of the narratives that we saw from government officials in the 1920s would ring very true today. They would make perfect sense to us today. You can see officials in places like Burma and otherwise saying, well, what's the point of instituting prohibition if all we get is a massive illicit market? And those voices were live at the time. Now, they didn't necessarily win. They didn't win out in most cases. But again, it shows that this is not something that's a totally new debate. It's something that we kind of need to reconnect with the history of. And I think that will give us a greater insight to it and probably a greater way to problem solve around it as well. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that whistle-stop tour. And I know you've been working in this area for some time. And I would urge people to look at your paper, because I know you've been working in this area, the historical aspect. And your paper, I was just looking at it, does challenge contemporary policy conceptions. And, for us to think about it from that historical perspective is very worthwhile. So thank you for that. We will have opportunity for questions at the end. So I will keep moving if you don't mind. And we'll ask Joanne, Professor Joanne Csete, to join us now and to take the floor. And Joanne's going to talk about more harm than public health in drug policy and address that question. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the editors as well and the organizers for including me in this important work. I think we all have COVID on the mind. COVID certainly has laid bare structural inequities and fundamental flaws in public health policy in many countries. Among other revelations, it's shown that it's sometimes easier for those in power to politicize a health issue and then manipulate the politicization of it than it is to base policy on scientific evidence. And where have we seen this before? We see it writ large in policy on illicit drugs, where well-established science is frequently dismissed almost inexplicably by policymakers in favor of such motivations as appearing to be tough on crime. And that happens even when the policies that they espouse are not only ineffective, but deadly. So health outcomes of ill-conceived and often racist and classist drug policies are only one indicator of the harm that these policies carry, but they are an important indicator. I think it's fair to say that the global mobilization to address HIV raised the profile of drug policy a lot, at least on the international stage. The continued disproportionate burden of HIV, TB, hepatitis C borne by people who use drugs is troubling, especially since they don't have to be that way. HIV linked to injection with contaminated equipment has been pretty much eliminated as a public health problem in most of the European Union and Switzerland, for example, through investment in a broad range of harm reduction services, combined with what is surely the most important health measure for people who use drugs, which is decriminalization or at least depenalization of nonviolent infractions. And I'll come back to that, and Professor Buxton has already made that remark. Injury and death from overdose remain major public health challenges and are likely to continue to be so, especially as fentanyl markets expand in many parts of the world. The experience of my own country, the US, which has seen a six-fold increase in opioid overdose mortality in the last 20 years, shows dramatically the horrific consequences of bad policy. now, of course, exacerbated by a failed response to COVID. At a time when everything possible should be done to remove barriers to medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, as well as barriers to naloxone use, we instead continue to butt our heads against longstanding irrational and politicized impediments to empirically proven best practices. In a few jurisdictions around the world, COVID has led to some loosening of restrictions on take-home doses of methadone, for example. These are restrictions that should have been loosened long ago. But even so, methadone and buprenorphine remain out of reach for the vast majority of people who might benefit from them in many countries, not just the US. The other side of the coin of irrational policy on opioids is that millions of people experience pain and suffering for lack of access to morphine and other opioids for pain management, because laws and regulations surrounding the medical use of these medicines are so onerous. There's an urgent global need to revisit the legal and policy frameworks of palliative care and pain management and the way in which medical professionals are taught and supported to make use of all the pain management tools that should be at their disposal. Coming back to what we might call effective decriminalization of a range of drug offenses, something we see in a number of countries, especially in Europe, the law in some countries in the EU may not be as explicit as in Portugal or the Czech Republic, where decriminalization is defined by cutoff amounts of drugs below which possession and sale and consumption are not considered crimes. But even without decriminalization in the letter of the law, it's relatively rare in a number of these countries that people would go to jail for a minor drug infraction. That enables countries then to, first of all, save a lot of money, because we know how expensive criminal prosecutions and incarceration are. And it enables them, if they have the political will, instead to offer assistance in housing, health, education, employment, and other services, the absence of which may have contributed to drug use patterns in the first place. These policies then seem to recognize the very important truth that it never is and it never will be a good idea to imprison someone who's living with a drug use disorder. I don't suggest that everything in these places, as you all know, is so great and certainly not perfect. And as Professor Buxton said, still largely within the framework of prohibition. But from the US, we look at the EU record with some envy, as our policies in the US continue to destroy disproportionately the lives and the communities of Blacks and low-income people who are the victims of mass incarceration, fueled in part by the drug war. Indeed, the sorry history of failed drug control in the US shows how easy it is for drug policy to be twisted into an instrument for racist and classist persecution, which plainly undermines health, human rights, and development. The US experience also shows how easy it is for drug control as part of foreign policy to exemplify a pernicious form of neocolonialism, which others on the panel can address better than I. So the development world, the human rights world, at a moment we're really now challenged in this time to understand racism and classism in public policy and to re-envision the role of policing and criminal prosecutions generally. Reimagining drug policy really has to be an important part of that reflection. And what's achieved in this re-envisioning, again, will be measured partly by health as well as development outcomes. Drug policy can be a leading edge of criminal justice reform, and it can embody anti-racist and anti-classist measures, all of which would contribute to the public's health and also to sustainable development. We have only to find the way politically. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Csete. That was quite moving. I found the first part of your presentation actually upsetting. It's disturbing to think of these harms, and I was glad that the second half of your presentation you spoke about some models of better practice. And I don't say best practice. I did deliberately say better practice because I'm based here in Ireland, where we do have a harm reduction philosophy, but again, we have all got room to improve. So thank you for sharing that, and I think you've certainly made an impassioned plea there for improvements and better policies. So thank you for that. We'll move on now to our next speaker, Ms. Csete Reitano. And Tuesday is going to speak to us today about making war, conflict zones, and their implications for drug policy. So I give the floor to you, Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Sorry, I was also trying to share a slide, but I can't work out how to do it. So I'm not entirely sure what I've done to the screen, but I hope it's not problematic for people. Thank you very much. My name is Csete Reitano. I'm the Deputy Director at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Very happy to be here with my colleague, Joan Collins. We are, I contributed to the journal a chapter on the intersection between conflict zones, drug policy and development. One of the questions, essentially, we basically went through a set of questions in my practitioner's note, asking first of all why you would ask this question, whether or not there is a relevance to asking specifically to a conflict zone, whether there's a relevant drug policy discussion to be had. Second of all, then asking why it is that drug policy conversation isn't so well embedded in the conflict space. And then finally exploring whether it should be, whether this is something the drug policy community should be pushing itself into and encouraging or offering lessons learned. In those three questions, the first one was quite easy to answer. And if I could share my screen, I could show you why, but I can't, so never mind. We took a look at the Security Council resolutions, and the Security Council of the UN system obviously being the highest governing body on peace and conflict, and counted the number of mentions of drug trafficking or drugs in the resolutions for the last 20 years. So we went from the year 2000 through to the year 2019, and found that there was a clear and accelerating trend towards an intersection between drug trafficking and the causes and the prolongation of interstate and intrastate conflict. It was initially at around 10%. By the end of the first decade, it was hitting 15. By the end of the second, it was more like 35. So out of 1,167 resolutions that have been passed by the UN Security Council in the last 20 years, upwards of 20% of them are now looking at drug trafficking or drug issues with or the management of illicit narcotics within the conflict theatre. So for us, I think that's a growing call to arms to the drug policy community to say there's something needed of you here. There is clearly a sense by which the illicit narcotic industry is either triggering or exacerbating or prolonging the nature of conflict. I think the question then came to be, well, if this is the case, why isn't there a drug policy conversation going on often in post-conflict or conflict states or peace-building environments? And I think that the question was, well, in some cases there were. So we know from the conflicts of Afghanistan, we know from the conflicts of Colombia, to a certain extent some in Asia, that there has been a drug policy dimension, but it's been very focused in a series of conflicts which were production zones. So where there were high labor-intensive drug production, there was a drug policy response and a development drug policy response in the alternative livelihoods debate. But what we've seen in contemporary conflicts over the last 10 to 15 years is actually a shift in the nature of that relationship between the drug economy and the conflict economy, which is more towards zones of fragility through which the drug trafficking industry is transiting. So the dynamic there is less one of production, but more one of protection, where armed, violent actors are raising revenue by the facilitation or the protection, so that taking a fee to allow the safe passage of narcotics through the territories that they control. And in fact, in another piece of work that we did jointly with Interpol and the Norwegian think tank RIPTO, the Global Center for Conflict Analysis, we estimated that around 28% of financing to conflict actors in contemporary conflicts is coming from the narcotics trade. So this is an immensely significant flow for contemporary conflict. But what we saw, however, into the space is that for those kinds of illicit economies where you're seeing militant actors, violent actors predating on an illicit economy, we seem to have far less to say in terms of what is the developmental or what is the drug policy or what is the harm reduction response in that context. So one of the questions then is, should there be space for the drug policy community to intervene into that conversation? I think the answer that we came forward with was yes, but why isn't there? So there are a couple of answers to the question of why isn't there. The first, I think, is because fundamentally the drug policy community has concentrated its own attentions far more in urban conflict or urban violence environments, in recognition of the fact that now that by far the highest rates of homicides are found in urban drug economies rather than in conflict zones, it was understandable to approach and focus upon the challenges and the solutions that were needed in that environment. But also, I think, largely because the door was not opened, if not, it was kept firmly shut in conflict zones. Conflict zones are extremely complicated. Conflicts or peace-building actors, peace and conflict actors and policymakers tend to be very focused on what they would consider to be the primary rationale for conflict. It's the conflict's drivers and the ideologies of the questions. And into that space, often the loudest voice claiming rights over the illicit economy are law enforcement. So it becomes very easy as a default for peace builders to turn to the loudest voice in the room with their hands up saying, drug control, addressing organized crime groups involved in narcotics trafficking, which is how they would characterize the conflict actors in that environment, is something that we can deal with. And so it becomes very quickly left to them, which has often led to the escalation of militarized approaches to the drug economy in the same way as it did in urban conflict environments. So I think there's an enormous amount of rationale to say that we should be applying a harm reduction approach in a conflict zone into the illicit narcotics industries in conflict and fragile states as much as we do in other environments. The question is, do we know how? So I wrote a brief overview of what we've called the violent governance paradigm, which when you move out of the production zone and into the further down the supply chains of the illicit drug economy, what you're seeing essentially is a self-reinforcing cycle of violent actors able to control territory. In the control of territory, they are able to tax any resources that pass through that territory. The resources that they generate, and which we've noted is an incredibly significant amount of money from the taxation of the drug economy, allows them to buy more weaponry. And with the combination of the capacity to wield violence, the capacity for territorial control, they leverage that into the conflict space. So increasingly, you're seeing militia groups with associations to the illicit economy and the drug economy using that for political leverage and legitimacy. And they're taking that legitimacy into the peace building cycle. So all of a sudden, what you have is an intensely political environment. And I think this is one of the points on which the drug policy community have rightly been hesitant in stepping forward. When you're dealing with such an intensely politicized space, and we've already seen in other environments the risks of a drug or a set of drug solutions becoming politicized, let's talk war and drugs for the last 50 years, do you want to have to deal with that in a fragile context also? And I think that it does make a lot of sense why you would step back rather than step forward to bring a set of development responses to the table. There's no question that the development responses to the illicit economy of drug production and trafficking, particularly further down the supply chain, are needed. But there are frankly very few good options. I think we tend to have an assumption that, if you can secure peace, if you can secure security, if you can secure development, then violence will be reduced and so will the incentives to engage in the illicit economy and in crime. And everybody's happy to leave that as the status quo. In fact, we've seen very much the opposite from a study of the illicit economy, that by no means is there an inverse relationship between development and illicit behavior. In fact, often the two go hand in hand, that it's involvement in the illicit economy that brings development to some people. And the actors who control the illicit economy space have a greater degree of legitimacy than a questionable state authority or still a contested state authority. So I think until we have a better, not only evidence base, but a policy evidence base to say we can provide viable alternative livelihoods for militia groups involved in drug trafficking, for the kind of nomadic movement that the groups in northern Mali, for example, are using, that we are ready with instruments that can address the nexus between criminal actors and corrupt actors in a conflict space, do we really have anything to bring to the table as a drug policy community? So I think to answer in conclusion to the questions, yes, there's a need to focus on drug policy questions in a conflict zone. Yes, there's a validity to the drug policy community asking for a seat at the table. But on the third one, is it the right time for us to do so? I would argue not necessarily, unless we have something to offer, because then we risk the politicization without necessarily ameliorating the problem. So the overall call from us has been for the drug policy community to try and come with innovation, to come with experimentation, to use the spaces where they have them to see what works, and where we have something that works to disseminate it more broadly, because there is very little question that a harm reduction approach is required to the entirety of the conflict and drug supply chain. But until we know what that looks like, maybe we just stay quiet. Thank you.
Thank you, Csete. That was excellent and really gave me actually food for thought, because as you were speaking, these are not some of the things I have researched myself, but living in Ireland and we having a political history, I'm immediately thinking from what you're saying, would the approaches be different depending on whether one, different stages of development of a country or a conflict? I mean, we're in a high income country, but we've had conflict, we have, urban drug problems, and a lot of what you're talking about, we have observed, and we're in a high income country. Would you have any comment on that?
I think you're right in to say that I don't think we have fantastic answers to the illicit drug economy on any spectrum of development, from fragile state to the most developed. It is still causing extraordinary harm, which is perhaps why a fragile state is one step too far. And the challenge being, it's difficult to access. It's difficult to gain traction. It's difficult to find a trusted set of interlocutors. The governance base all the way through remains so contested. The criminal justice system and the rule of law is often highly compromised. How do you inject a set of answers into that space? And I mean, we have to try, and there has been some experimentation, and development-led approaches, I would say, have shown nascently better results than others. But there is always a risk of over-tipping, so legitimizing violent actors simply because they have shown their ability to resource themselves from drugs. The counterfactual, I guess, that you allow the fight against drugs to become so politicized that being called a narco trafficker becomes a way of delegitimizing a valid political opposition, which is also incredibly common in a contested political space. So it's fraught with hazards. I don't think it means that we shouldn't do it at all, but I do think it means we should really evaluate very carefully before we go in with a set of prescriptions.
Thank you. I like that idea. Yes, that we don't have all the answers, but we're working on it.
Exactly.
I'll open the floor now for all of our speakers, and we can take questions. We have questions or comments from one speaker to another. So if you want to unmute your microphones, if any of our own panelists have any comments they'd like to add to any of the speakers, or any questions that they would like to ask.
So if I may ask a question, sort of comment come question.
Thank you, Mark.
So my own background is humanitarian, and I spent some years working in the field of negotiating humanitarian agreements with armed groups. Now, these armed groups are always in a very difficult position because they are illegal, obviously. Whatever cause they espouse, whether it's very territorial or ethnic or more ideological, whatever, they will always be fighting against the authorities that exist, the states that exist, or the state that they are in. Therefore, they are illegal. Being illegal means that they don't have any legal way of raising funds. So they will obviously turn to illegal ways of raising funds. Drugs, of course, is one of the main activities which they can indulge in to raise money to further their cause. There could also be human trafficking or others. Weapons trafficking, of course, would then be another one. So there's kind of a two-faced system where you can look at a group, an armed group, and say, oh gosh, yes, they have a wonderful cause. I believe in Group X's fantastic work to defend the rights of the minority, blah 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 blah. But of course, you then will ignore what's happening underneath and all this funding system. You could also get to a situation where this funding situation means that there's a lot of interest in continuing it. Therefore, you don't really want peace, do you? You don't want them to achieve any political aims, because the political aims start to become secondary, because what you'd call criminal aims will become much more important. So this is something that fascinated me in those days when I was working on these files, and wondering, what's the real issue? I mean, we might be working with an armed group to try and persuade them to not use children as fighters, which is a worthy cause. But at the same time, you can't really say to them, but could you stop trafficking in drugs, because you know that then they don't have any funds left. What's interesting for me in this whole conversation, and this is finally get into my question, is, we are talking about this fascinating and very important topic. What traction are we gaining with policymakers around the world? To what extent are the various UN organizations involved in peace building? To what extent are the various governments, the United States government, we have Joanne, Csete here, to what extent are they getting some sort of echo of this conversation we're having and saying, maybe there are things that can be done better? Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Would anybody like to take that? Julia?
Well, I think that's certainly a question I'd like to hear Csete or John respond to, if they're minded to do that, because I think part of the collaboration that we've had with their organisation has been so important for us in terms of putting this journal together. So I'd very much like to hear from Csete or John.
Thank you. John, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can give it a try. Thanks, Julia. No, it's funny. I was thinking the links between what Catherine and Csete were saying, and Catherine, I was thinking of the experience of Ireland, and it is sort of it's a privileged position for somewhere like Ireland to be in, because I remember we had discussions around the Northern Ireland peace process at LSE, and we had senior police officials there, and they were saying, our effective aim was to make paramilitaries become ordinary decent criminals. So the criminality was seen as, on a menu of bad options, it's the less bad option on the menu. And in a place like Ireland or Northern Ireland, where you've also got this massive Keynesian effort around the peace process going on, you sort of have an ability to make those kind of choices. But in, I think, a lot of the context, I think particularly Csete would be talking about, it's such a conflagration that you can't prioritize policies. You can't make those kind of implicit decisions, which of course they wouldn't say explicitly we're seeking to empower criminal groups, but certainly if it means that paramilitaries are disbanding with the option to go into criminality, that's probably the less bad scenario in the immediate term, and then we can deal with the consequences later. That's just a thought that's come to my mind, and it's come up a few times. On whether these ideas are being inculcated at the international level, I would take a relatively very small o optimistic view on this. Julia and I may slightly differ on this, and maybe Joanne and I might slightly differ on this as well. But I think, if we take an incrementalist vision of international drug control, it has moved very fast, very in the last decade, right? Compared to where it was, the conversation is radically different. The scope for conversation is radically different, even if the implementation of policy is not. So I think what we've seen and what we saw around the UNGAS process, or the UN General Assembly Special Session in 2016, was an appetite, or an overt appetite, for member states for alternative policies. And there was, the obvious options of you can go for legalization, you can go for more drug war, you can go for a kind of harm reductionist approach to the supply side, although we don't necessarily know exactly what that looks like. And was the appetite, but not necessarily the range of policy options that we may have liked. And thus, that's the longue durée of these issues. I think that's exactly what Tuesday's highlighting, is there's no necessarily easy answers for a lot of these questions. But I think taking an incrementalist approach, seeing that we are, I'm an optimist on marijuana legalization only in the sense that it is the largest scale experiment that we have on this topic. So we will learn an awful lot about what happens when you shift away from a uniformly illicit market to licit markets in some contexts. And that's a great data set to have, right? That's a very interesting case study to have and try to apply the lessons elsewhere. So no, we don't have answers, I don't think, but I definitely think we've made progress in at least opening up the discussion. And then there we have a long way to go. So I'll leave it there, but I hope that was answering the question.
Thank you. Yes, I'll bring in Tuesday, and then perhaps Joanne, you'd like to comment, because I loved your emphasis on the person, on the individual, harm reduction on the person in terms of policy. So I'll bring in Tuesday first, and then maybe Joanne, I'll come back to you then. Tuesday, we can't hear you. You could unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you. I think John definitely made a sort of the correct direction in his response. I think there's been more traction increasingly, particularly following the Mali conflict in 2011, where it was so clear the extent to which drug trafficking had resourced northern separatists, but also that it was bleeding into the political process. And I think this is where peace builders have begun to understand that this isn't so much a problem that can be shoved aside for another day. The problem with the violent governance paradigm, as I described it, is often the counterfactual or the counterpart to violence is corruption. And it's in allowing the resources from the illicit economy to strengthen the legitimacy of nominally political actors or to give them a seat at the table often means, as Tony said, that they're very reluctant to release that source of funding afterwards. And that very quickly you end up baking into your post-conflict period a set of actors who are primarily or formidably interested in ensuring that their source of resources continue. Certainly that's the case in Guinea-Bissau, where lack of other alternatives, punitive structural adjustment, meant that you had an entire elite political class whose primary source of revenue was narcotics trafficking. I also think one of the other dynamics that the transit trade has brought to play, which is quite different than some of the more historic intersections between conflict and drugs, is that it's often these high value flows of particularly cocaine, which have no local market. So there's very much a strong sense locally of, well, frankly, who cares? Nobody's using it here. It's on its way somewhere else. So what harm is really being done? And as it's been a primary tenet of the drug policy community since the beginning, you can't eradicate any livelihood unless you can replace it with a legitimate alternative. This horrible intersection of very poor economic zones with very few alternative livelihoods. I mean, we're talking about, the Sahel Sahara, where transit trade in drugs which are not used locally. The real question is, well, what is the harm? Is there a harm? And if you do remove the narcotics trade, what do you get instead? Well, became really serious policy questions. And I remember sitting with UN System and going, I went on EU missions and advisory programs and type of things, and they're like, well, maybe we could start a road building program for former drug traffickers. And you imagine really telling these young men who've gotten high on cocaine profits that their next job is digging roads in the Sahara Desert. I mean, that's worse than prison labor. Nobody's going to go with that. That sounds like a fantastic, sustainable alternative. So I think the real question is, like, what do you do? I also think, though, that maybe actually the answers come more from the DDR community, so the demobilization, reintegration community, than they do necessarily from the alternative livelihoods and drug policy community. We know that violent actors have a tendency to demobilize into violent industries where their violence is a commodity in and of itself. So, former militants go into security, they go into provision of private security, which then in and of itself often becomes predatory. So the problem with classic demobilization is it's almost demobilized them into the illicit economy and created drug gangs, which then we can't eradicate either, drug gangs which are mobilized by political leaders in order to further influence the political violence dynamic. So the whole situation is very fraught. So what we say is, first of all, because you need a very nuanced political economy. One of the greatest challenges actually in the post-conflict space was often the illicit economy was not factored into the political economy assessments that were done. There must be the first step. The second, I think, is a set of, if you want to go back to the term of elite bargains, but essentially you have to start cleaving a line between what is acceptable behavior and what isn't.
Thank you.
And how do you reduce the number of people involved in the illicit economy and minimize the harm that's done?
Excellent. Thank you. I think great food for thought there. I would, before we run out of time, would like to bring Joanne in, and just from a different perspective as well, to maybe give her a few moments to share some of her thoughts on what we've been discussing. Joanne, may I ask you to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. Just a few maybe threads that I'm not sure I'll be able to weave together properly, but certainly the U.S. is the champion at using the narco trafficker charge for political purposes internationally. Most recently, perhaps with Maduro, but Professor Buxton will know lots more about that than I do. But I think with U.S. drug policy, as much as there are political motivations for things like that, it's always best to follow the money. U.S. narco foreign policy has clearly been about selling arms, about militarizing police around the world, about selling glyphosate, about doing the bidding of corporations like Monsanto, like the military corporations. And much as people in my neighborhood are happy that the executive branch of our government after January will no longer be headed by somebody who's certifiably insane, we were upset that the Trump Department of Defense was led by somebody who came from an executive position in Raytheon, a military contractor. But President-elect Biden has named somebody who's been on the board of Raytheon. So again, the militarization is part of why it's so hard for U.S. foreign policy related to drugs. The fact that the Defense Department is really a salesperson for the military manufacturers in the U.S. is something that really needs to be looked at. On the matter of John Collins' observation of the overt appetite for alternative policies and international discussions. Oh, yes, we are going to treat drug users like patients, not criminals. I don't think they should be treated like patients either, but that's another story. I think that there's an overt appetite for engaging in rhetoric on alternative policies. I'm not really sure that the appetite for alternative policies is all that great, although I say that at a moment when the first U.S. state, Oregon, has just gone to a very Portugal-type model of decriminalizing minor offenses for all drugs, which will be a much more interesting thing to look at in many ways than cannabis alone. But those efforts seem to be so halting and so infrequent. I think we really have to scratch the surface of all of this pronouncement, especially in the UN, of health-oriented drug policy. Are we really talking about countries that are investing in health and social services instead of in criminal law measures? Are we really talking about countries that are not doing things like adopting a US-type drug court model that is really not a health intervention in any sense? And I could go on and on about that. But I do think that I appreciate, I agree with John to some degree that, yes, the narrative has changed, the rhetoric has changed to some degree, and that's a good thing. It will open up discussions that weren't had before. But I do think that we sometimes have to scratch the surface on these famous public health approaches to drug policy, because we don't see better health outcomes unless there is a serious re-envisioning of the importance of harm reduction and the importance of things like safe supply, which is a whole other pillar of drug policy that's barely being discussed outside of a few places, Canada and so on.
Thank you, Joanne. I might just add something to that as well. Myself, I'm chair of the Scientific Committee of the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drugs Addiction. And thank you. And there has been great debate about the new EU drug strategy, which was due out this year under the German presidency. And when German presidency saw the strategy, they weren't happy with it. The strategy has two main pillars, health and security. And across the EU, they did feel that security was too heavy-handed and that we did not want to lose the harm reduction approach that we have worked on for over 20 years here in Ireland as well. So there has been good debate at an EU level. The strategy now will probably be finalised, if not at the end of the German presidency, but it ends at the end of the year here, or with the Portuguese presidency who are taking over. But the Portuguese presidency will be responsible then for the actual action plan on the strategy. And another thing you just mentioned there, you mentioned about various inputs, but one thing we're not measuring globally is outputs in terms of outcomes of people who use drugs. And that is something European Monitoring Centre have been looking at. We measure treatment demand, we measure deaths, we measure the number of hepatitis C, the numbers in prison. I want to know how many people get their lives back. This to me, measuring outputs is really important as well. And across Europe as well, there is a whole reframing of the word recovery. We've taken ownership of it as opposed to meaning it in a greater sense in terms of rehabilitation. And recovery for one person may be completely different to recovery for another. For a mother, it could be getting her children back. For somebody who wants to work, might be getting a job, while still on maybe medically assisted treatment. So there has been good debate across Europe, but as you said in your own talk there, good, but we can do better. So certainly be focusing on that.
Well, the Portuguese have probably done more than anyone to try to measure these quality of life kinds of outcomes, as you say. So to have them in an important position in the European discussion will be great.
Great, yes. Thank you. Julia, would you like to say anything, or shall we go straight to our closing remarks? We are approaching our final moments.
I think it's been fantastic for Joanne to bring that together at the end. That's it's wonderful to hear from Joanne. So she's really caught everything that I possibly could have said in a less fluent way. I'd love to hear from Tony, home soil. So over to Tony.
Okay, so I introduce you, Tony. Are you there? Mr. Tony Duffin, CEO of, as I said previously, the wonderful Liffey project, and I'm very familiar with the work that they do. They've been quite pioneering in Ireland. Fabulous harm reduction, and no better advocate for people who use drugs than their CEO, Tony Duffin. So, Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine, and hello from Dublin. Hello from Ireland's oldest harm reduction service. We were established in 1982, so quite some time. And it's very interesting to hear people talk about, the panelists talk about, what to do. Don't do anything unless you know what to do. We didn't know exactly what we were going to do at the beginning, I'm sure, but we worked things out as we went along, and I think it's better to do something than do nothing. What we're doing isn't working globally, so we need to do something. We need to try other innovative and progressive ways of working. So I'd like to thank the co-organisers, the International Development Policy Journal, the Global Commission on Drug Policy and Trinity College Dublin for working with us to organise this event. I'd like to thank Catherine, who's the chair, who I know well, who's just across the river from me right now. It's all very strange, isn't it, being global and being online all the time. I'm looking forward to catching up with everybody physically. I'd like to also thank the excellent speakers, Julia, John, Joanne, and Tuesday. Thank you for your inputs. As Joanne said at the end, there's so many ideas and so much that is interweaving. I'm left. I'm going to go away and think about all this afterwards. But which is a good sign of a good discussion. It is clear from the presentations today that punitive drug policies have impacted on achieving development goals. For poverty-stricken communities with no realistic options but to produce drugs, and for the individual user and their communities in Dublin, for example, where these issues impact. As Joanne notes, the reality of drug policies in most countries is that they undermine public health by failing to protect people who use drugs from infectious disease and the risk of drug overdose. For example, drug laws and policies that mandate incarceration for minor non-violent drug offences have profound health costs, as the risk of infectious disease in prison is high, and too few prisons offer appropriate health services for people who use drugs. And of course, you know, even as I think about this, you know, I know that we in prison in Ireland, we do our best by people, but there are too many people in prison with drug problems. Arguably, who shouldn't be there depending on their case and such. But you know, I think it's something like over 50% of people in Mountjoy prison are on methadone maintenance prescriptions. You know, then I suppose Ireland has been and is impacted by drug policies that have undermined our public health over the past 43 years since the Misuse of Drugs Act was enacted in 1977. However, Ireland has experienced drug policy reforms in the last number of years, such as the legislation for supervised injection facilities in 2017 and the Irish government's decision in 2019 to implement a health-led response to possession of drugs for personal use, which is all great. But unfortunately, these policies have yet to be implemented. So it's 3 years since the injecting facilities legislation was enacted, and we still don't have our first pilot. So there's reasons for that, but obviously it's still frustrating not to see those things. Now, I think with regard to the health-led response, my understanding is that we should certainly know more by the end of the first quarter of 2021, and maybe even see the beginning of the implementation, but that remains to be seen. The impact of our drug policies on the health and well-being of the individuals, the family and the community across Ireland is apparent in many ways. However, time is limited, and I will draw your attention to one example. In the latest iteration of Ireland's National Drug Strategy, entitled Reducing Harm, Support and Recovery, drug-related intimidation continues to receive attention at the national level and is noted as an area of special concern for the country as it presents a real threat to public safety and communities. Drug-related intimidation is now commonplace in communities across Ireland, where disputes over drug market territory, drug debts, and between rival gangs have greatly damaged both family and social bonds, leaving residents feeling isolated and even more vulnerable. The breakdown within communities has substantially impacted quality of life, with people even being afraid to engage in local amenities and venture into spaces dubbed as no-go areas. Anna Liffey has spent the last 15 months in the northeast in the city of Dublin, working with stakeholders there on an action research project, focusing, as I say, on drug-related intimidation, and the report will be published in 2021, early 2021, hopefully January, possibly February. And whilst I won't preempt the findings of that report, suffice to say that sadly, drug-related intimidation is a very significant problem there. Drug-related intimidation or extortion, that's what it is a direct result of the illicit market, which breeds fear and violence. So we really have, you know, since as I say, 1977, we have more drugs, we have more harm, we have more violence, we have more death. It's just not working. There are lots of good things in Ireland around policies that we have implemented. I don't want to take away from that, but we do need to do much more, and that's why these discussions help to inform that. I suppose I just want to say that any improvements on reducing the demand is to be welcomed, and during the first wave of COVID-19, gains were made in this regard in Dublin, when waiting times for methadone were reduced from 12 to 14 weeks to 2 to 3 days. And benzodiazepine maintenance prescriptions were permitted by the HSE, the Health Service Executive, something that were not previously allowed for. This intervention was targeted at people who are homeless and who use drugs. When further research is completed, it will be interesting to see the impact of the improved access to providing the medication that people need and how their quality of life has been affected. Because it's not like we didn't have those things before, it's that the access to them improved greatly. Will it have had an impact on satisfying at least some of the market? Because satisfying the market seems to me to be essential. And will it have reduced negative consequences like drug-related intimidation? Anecdotally, I can tell you from knowing the people who have received the medication, who have been housed during COVID, I think it will have. But, you know, anecdotally is one thing. Let's get the evidence and the proof. Time and research will hopefully tell. There are no quick fixes, but there is much that can be done to improve the situation and further help to achieve development goals at a local and national level. So that's what I was just going to reflect on with you all. I'd like to thank everybody for their attention. I thank the panel, and just to remind people that the recording will be available on the DevPol website, and we will send out satisfaction survey. So that's me.